All right, this is our third section for Unit 9. It's the third and final part for World War II. We're going to be focusing on the home front here. A lot of this is sections that are, I'm not giving a lot of details here. This is where we watch a lot of videos. It's going to be some vocabulary words you must know, as well as the broad ideas, is the basic parts that you have here with it. Whole mixture of standards, but you will see that this is where we'll come back to the Florida domestic government policy that will have the efforts to expand and contract rights for various populations during World War II that you have. Bracketing dates, obviously the beginning and ending of World War II, but also this is where the basis for the civil rights movement, feminist movement, some early things for the Cold War are started. All right, I'm very broad on this here, but this is where the government will grow immensely during World War II. Our federal government has grown a lot since the beginning of our country. The two biggest times probably that it ever did was Civil War and World War II. Key thing about World War II, this is after it also grew greatly in the Great Depression. Now, during a war, your focus is to win wars there. So this is where the federal government will focus all efforts on this. Now, I had the question, what about liberties? World War II was our last declared war that we had in the United States. In a declared war, you lose your rights or your freedoms or your liberties. So you don't have freedom of speech. I give an example of later on we will have the Vietnam conflict, which we will have an actress by the name of Jane Fonda who will be doing blood drives for the North Vietnamese. If she was to have done something like that during World War II, she would have been executed for treason. So that's the difference between a declared and undeclared war. All right, the Office of Price Administration will regulate everything when it comes to prices, wages, but the main thing they're going to be doing is going to be our ration stamps. If you happen to be able to, in your interview, find one of the few people that you still can interview from World War II that was old enough to remember things from it, they will tell you about these food stamps or ration stamps. And what these were books that you had, and even though you may have the money to buy a certain amount of things, you couldn't buy it. You had to have the stamps with it. So you see that ration coupon for 5 meats, fats, fish, or cheeses. You got a certain amount of those each month. What some people would do is trade it. Let's say that you had one for gasoline and you didn't need it, but you wanted more for things for something like, again, the meats. So you could trade with others. Were there black markets? Yes, but not many people used it. I go through this class, I kind of describe it where on the War on Terror and how many people in class actually have a family member that was involved, that was in Afghanistan or in Iraq or in Africa in the last 19 years. And I had 0 in one class, 7 in another, and 3 in another. So realistically, about 4 or 5 students a class that had personally a close family member. If I was asked that same question in the early 40s during World War II, it would be about half the people that would have a brother, sister there, and the other half would have cousins and people that they were in school with just a couple of years ago. So if you did buy something on the black market, you could be actually hurting your own family member and friends. And the war did mean something, and that's why people were willing to do these personal sacrifices there. But here's where they lost the freedoms. You couldn't just go out and buy as much gas or food that you want. All right, how to pay for the war. American Story of Us was telling about how putting people to work, and this is where people that got to work, they're also paying more taxes. We will raise taxes, but it still needs a lot more. For the third time this year, we have the term bonds. Bond is a loan to the government, and this is where in both the Civil War, World War I, now World War II, we have these bonds. And what happens is you can look at them as an investment, but a lot of people will do it for patriotic reasons, but it will pay off as there. You see the different posters. We will have celebrities that will promote trying to raise bonds. Those of you that have watched the original Captain America, that's what he was doing, was a bond drives also in the beginning of that movie. So this is where you have now, I say, how does it help the U.S. after the war ended? If, let's say, you were spending $50 a week purchasing war bonds in 1942, 43, 44, just where you had some extra money and you're supporting your country, You put those away, and later on they mature, and they're in the 1950s. They're now worth $100, and you start cashing them in. And so a lot of people, it made them do investments that later on were worth more money and will help the economy even more in the 1950s. Okay, big reason why we won the war was we just outproduced Germany and Japan. We were bombing the heck out of them. We produced for ourselves, our allies, and we were the sleeping giant that's awoke. Our tanks may not have been as good as the Germans' tanks, but we made a lot more. Our planes may not have flown as fast as the Japanese Zeros, but we made more and more. Again, how did we win the war on the Atlantic? Part of it was with Liberty ships as we go. Now, this organization takes place, and this is where the government will come in, and they will tell businesses what they are to make. Who they're to sell for. They were allowed to make a profit, but they just couldn't go and have a free market of selling who the largest bidder was. Again, businesses that have the rights to take it. So individuals do, now businesses have it. But they would try to find the best combination. America's Story of Us has the little story of, about the factory that was making the tracer bullets, but at one time had been a fireworks factory. Here in Citrus County at one time, it's now gone to North Carolina, but at one time we had a large factory that made a lot of fishing boats between the sizes of 16 to 28 feet. Well, they would maybe have something like that. They would come in and tell them that they must make those landing craft that we have seen in different videos. You see this graph where the automobile production after Pearl Harbor, we're not making many cars. Ford's making the Jeeps. We have Chevys making engines for airplanes. That's why if you have a classic cars, 42, 43, 44, 45 cars are very rare to find on there. Meanwhile, you see the tank production that goes up. By the time we get to the end of 1943, we start lowering it because we know that the end is going to be sometime near with this. So. All right, the next war board is the Office of War Information. They're most famous for all the different type of war posters. You've seen some in here about the bonds and things like that. But they're using propaganda. Yes, our government used propaganda. You need to have people support it. So what are you trying to do? You're supposed to maintain the public morale. You want people to support this war. You got to encourage sacrifice and conserve resources. Yes, there was laws about rationing, but can they really enforce it that much? You need people to willingly be a part of this. And they want to make sure that they increase the war production that you have. They're going to have movies in there. We're going to have all kinds of movies. A lot of people think Ronald Reagan was a great military hero. No, he was an actor that played it. But this is where we're going to have for trying to support the war, and it will be propaganda. The question, who was used for comedy? Well, the number one person would be Adolf Hitler that you want to have and to make fun of. All right, you'll see with these different posters there where there's different themes. You know, in my room, I have the one that says we're fighting for this, where it has the Nazi boot stepping on the church steeple. But you see here things to try to buy war bonds in order to encourage the buying of the war bonds so that your children are safe. The idea you're not supposed to talk to people, not even her, okay? Here. The idea for sacrificing and conserving. Here's an interesting one I decided to throw in here with it. But for our soldiers, to try to remember, look out because, well, syphilis and gonorrhea and STDs are a real thing. So they needed to be careful with this in here. This is one I want to take a little time to look at it in here. And this is why the idea that you have, okay, that you need to carpool. Because if not, you're hurting the soldiers, you're helping Hitler. All right, we've talked a lot of things along the way of different things for science. The Manhattan Project, we had a section before. Radar and sonar has come up in different sections. So we will have a massive amount of research that's done. But a lot of other research that people don't think of that was done in World War II. Fertilizer, pesticides, insecticides, different things we'll do agriculturally because we need our farmers to produce more. So this is where we gave them aids to it. We're going to have a lot of things with medicines, preservations, because we're wanting to make sure that we get as much of this material to the soldiers. For our code breakers, where we saw on Midway, and these are the people that are trying to break those codes and get the information that's being sent. We will have the Selective Service Act, as you saw before we ever even join the war, but we will still end up having a lot of people that are volunteering. We will have over 10 million people that are drafted in addition to the volunteers. Meanwhile, we'll also have different areas at home. We have the Civil Air Patrol. We're going to have the Mosquito Fleet here in Florida, which is people in fishing boats that are going to have it. I told a story in class about how on the top of the clock tower here in Citrus County, in the courthouse, that picture you see our courthouse, they removed the clocks, and we had high school girls that were taught to identify different type of German planes and would be up there in case there was ever an invasion. They were taught to learn that. On the coast of Florida, we had people that were there looking for submarines. The Great Depression was good for the South and the West, but World War II would also be good because a lot of the military institutions were built in the South and the West. The West because the focus on the Pacific Theater. The South because, first of all, the most likely place for a German invasion would have been probably North Florida or South Georgia, and also for the weather and what we could do, and there was a lot of resources, and when something had to be built new and not converted, they had a lot of resources and labor that was in the South that can do it there. Between the Great Depression and World War II, the South will make up for decades of being behind industrially. They still were a bit behind after that in some places of the South, but a lot of the areas was now modern, which it may not have been before. There are going to be a lot more people moving to the cities because we have these factories there. So we're going to have people move to the cities. How are they going to contribute? This is where one of the things we'll see is victory gardens. So, and you're encouraged to, if you lived in a suburb there, you don't need to have a big yard, start growing plants. But even if you lived in a city, so you have some flower planters. Instead of planting flowers, plant some vegetables or something that you can eat. Because the more you grow, the more that you have it where what the farmers are growing are able to go to the soldiers and our allies. Again, our farmers are going to have to do more. They could actually, if you are a farmer, you could get exemptions from the military if you were seeing it basically as essential in that way. We're going to have scientific improvements, technological improvements to tractors and other equipment. Again, it's not just the food for us, it is also the food to our allies throughout the world, many of the places that were being bombed. In the middle of all this, we're going to have the 1944 election. FDR is going to win the fourth presidential election. He is the only one to win 3, then 4 elections. A key thing about it, though, was after having other vice presidents, he will decide in 1944 that to switch for vice president. A little known guy by the name of Harry Truman was chosen. Most people didn't care because all they saw was Roosevelt. He's going to continue on. Little did we know, Roosevelt was actually really sick, and he will end up dying very early in his 4th term, which meant that Harry Truman will take over, and this is why we will have him to make, where I said in the last section, probably the hardest decision made in the history of the world. For women are going to be involved in so many different ways. We're going to have over 200,000 directly in the military. We are going to have the WAC, sometimes it's WAC, sometimes you'll see WAAC, the Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. We're going to have the WAVES, where the women that were in the Navy. We're going to have the WASPs that are in the Army Air Corps, which is like the Air Force. They're going to do all kinds of jobs, which will make it where for men that would have been doing those jobs, they are able to do other things. Not just nurses, not just office work. That is a large what they did, but we will have women pilots that they will be flying there. They may not be in the heart of the combat, but they are there. Biggest thing though for women, this is where, represented by Rosie the Riveter, we're going to have millions of women that go into the workforce. And we're going to have President Roosevelt, who's going to issue an executive order that makes it equal pay. So they're going to have the same pay by their war jobs, whether they're a male, a female, white, or black, which I'll get to that point there. And so women were earning the same as a man depending on their job. If they were a welder, they got paid what welders got paid. But after the war ended, what was expected here? And this is where women that have been paid as equals are no longer paid as equals. Many of them did go back and become housewives, but a lot of them didn't. And here's the basis for a lot of our feminist movement that we're going to have in the late 50s, but 60s and 70s there. There are going to be family difficulties. A Dear John letter. This is where for someone that maybe they got married early in life when they thought when they were going off to war. They just met someone there. So soldiers would be off at war and they get this letter, Dear John, I'm sorry we separated in here, and they're having for divorce. Or again, maybe even it was a longer term, but they've been away for a while. Child care. Yeah, women are working, but how are they going to work with this? We have stories of women that left their children in their car while they're working in the factory. But what normally happened was women will work together, and these working moms, and almost like their own little daycare systems of people that were working the second shift would take care of the children of those that were working in the first or third shift and things like that you have. Soldiers without guns. You saw with that, my grandmother was part of the WWII in here. This is actually a pretty funny video, in this way a cartoon at that time, but it does show a lot of things that I've been talking about here. Alright, we're going to have the Civilian Defense Corps in Florida. You notice that we have all these volunteers. The Mosquito Fleet, that is actually, they have this on our EOC terms that you're supposed to be familiar with. And this is where, like in this area, Citrus County, we would actually train some people that lived on the coast to try to be able to spot enemy boats on there. I have mentioned before about with the things that we have for the beach observation towers. We're going to have horses that are going up and down the shores that are looking for any signs of anybody comes in there. The Civil Air Defense, where I've talked about for like here in Citrus County, where high school girls will be used for this. All right, for Japanese Americans, we're going to have second and third generation Americans, but they're of Japanese descent. After Pearl Harbor, Franklin Roosevelt will issue Executive Order 9066, and over 100,000 Japanese Americans are forced to go to these internment camps. There were also some for other Asians that were mistaken, but it is mainly the Japanese Americans that were for. They lost their home, they lost their business, they end up going to these prisons. Now, if you see some of the pictures here on the bottom, they look a lot like some of the work camps that were early on for Nazi Germany. And even though we will never have anything like the death camps that occurred later on, this is where we will be putting some of our own citizens that we're suspecting that they're not loyalty. And this is where the loyalty review program comes in. We want to make sure these Japanese Americans were not against the United States. And again, sometimes we're talking about people that their grandparents were the ones that were from Japan, not them. We have a lawsuit that sued and said that this is taking away from the 14th Amendment. And in Korematsu versus U.S., the Supreme Court rules in favor of the United States government. They uphold the internment policy and say that this is a time of crisis. Again, people lose their rights in a time of war. We will have over 20,000 Japanese Americans that serve in the military during the war also. So we have on both sides of this. But this is where when we look at history and we celebrate our success, but we also have to look at one of our failures that we had. This is one of the failures we had in America, basically looking at other Americans and accusing them and putting them in jails. I mean, that's what the internment camps were. Just because of their ancestry. They were Americans there just because they were Japanese ancestry. Here's a map showing where different camps were that were out in the western area. Native Americans. We'll have over 25,000 Native Americans that are going to serve. One of the most interesting stories, and if you ever see the movie Wind Talkers, is of the group of Indians, the Navajos. The Navajos were told to not speak in their own language, where back in the Dawes Act that we had in the late 1800s, they were trying to lose their own culture, but then English had been passed down. Now, what happened with the Navajo Code Talkers were, and we saw on the movie Midway, and what those code breakers are trying to do is figure out what they are saying to each other in code. Well, what we did is we put different Navajo Indians on each boat, and they were able to talk to each other in their native language. The Japanese never had that and figure out what would happen. For the Navajo Indians, they each had their own protector, which unfortunately, if there was a chance they were going to get caught, the last order was to shoot the Navajo Indian to make sure that none of them got into contact with the Japanese to then break that code. Again, the movie Toe Talkers has that, although it's not as good because that was used mainly on the boats. There were some on land, but that's mainly on the boat. A lot of Native Americans moved off the reservations, got jobs in wartime industries, and many of them never came back. And this is where we're going to have a brain drain on a lot of our reservations. And some of the problems we're going to have in the 60s and the 70s for Native Americans was from this. It's time for war, so what do we say to our friends down south? Come here, we want you to work. Again, World War I, we encouraged next Americans to come and work in there. In World War II, we'll do it again. And we'll have these bracieros there, not only the workers, but the temporary, the areas where they lived, are also called that. Now, there will be a backlash against some of these. The Zoot riots, 1943, and basically in LA. There was some that happened in San Diego. There was going to be where soldiers, where you see some of the pictures down on the bottom, will just beat up on these young Mexican American boys. Now what they wore, which was a kind of like the baggy pants of that time period, you wear these real baggy double-breasted suits there. And so that's why they're called the Zoot riots. What ended up happening for these soldiers, a lot of them, they were just basically told what you did was wrong. All right, get back on the boat, go kill some Japs. And so this is where we will have it, where sometimes these soldiers, where people think, oh, they're just letting out a little bit of steam. But again, there was attacks that was racially motivated against these Mexican immigrants and younger people that you have. All right, African Americans during the war. First of all, we still have a segregated military in World War II. This is where we were going to have separate units there. The most famous of these units is the Tuskegee Airmen. I'm probably going to show you a short video on them and go a little bit more detail of them in class. One of the most medaled groups that we will have. And you see Tuskegee, yes, that is from where we have Booker T. Washington's old Tuskegee Institute. But for our workers, African American workers were not getting paid the same as white workers. And Philip Randolph, who at that time was the largest leader, had gone to Franklin Roosevelt and said that they were looking to do a march on Washington. Now, during war, you don't have the right to go on strike. But what if tens of thousands of black workers went on strike because they're not getting paid the same? We would have to send our army out in our own country against them. So this is when FDR will do Executive Order 8802, said the Flair Employment Act. But what this said was that if you worked in the war industry, so something working for something that's producing something military-wise, then you would get the same pay for whatever your job was. Whether you were male, female, black, white, it didn't matter. Again, if you were a welder. Now, this is where, again, you were paid by your ability, not by your skin color or your gender. That will go away after the war ends, but this will, again, be one of the things leading to the civil rights movement that we'll be having in the 1950s. The double V slogan here, and the idea that you have for African Americans, this was something in Florida as well as all over the nation, that you're fighting for victory over fascism abroad, but you're trying to get equality at home. Show that you are equal. Show that you can do the same job, whether it be in the military or in the factory there. And this will be, for, again, some of the basis that we will have for the civil rights movement. A interesting thing here in Florida, West Palm Beach County Schools will end up changing the summer vacation. Now, down in South Florida, the growing season is in the winter. You don't grow during the summer. And what ended up happening is they needed more workers during the winter time for the winter vegetables. So what Palm Beach County did is they actually changed the entire school schedule and made it where they were off for 3 months in the winter, so that for the black schools, so the blacks could go and work in the fields. They didn't do that for the white schools. And this is where there will be a lawsuit that was put off till the end of the war. But the lawsuit had said that you could not have this if you're supposed to be equal with things. It will actually be used in part of the arguments in Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Various things for the state of Florida. We will have a lot of German POW camps. They will be working, especially harvesting fruits and vegetables there. We're going to have over 2 million men and women that train for other states here. This is where I had mentioned Camp Blanding. We're going to have 8 military bases in 1940. It's going to be over 170 3 years later. Again, we have a lot of small airfields, other military bases. For women, we'll have the training centers in both in Palm Beach, Daytona. There, my grandmother moved from Kansas, and where she was training as a WWII, she was in West Palm Beach. We'll have 3 Seminole Indians that were from Florida that will serve. We'll have almost 250,000 Floridians that serve in the war, over 50,000 African American, and we will have over 3,000 Floridians that die fighting in the war. This is where I mentioned about the POWs, the prisoner of war camps, that we had German prisoner of wars here. And a little interesting story is the town of Frostproof, not too far outside of Lakeland. They had a bombing range, and as planes would work on for the different bombing range, there was a problem that they had, is that there was twice it was accidentally bombed because the lights in the town looked sort of like what was made in the targeting range, and so sometimes from a distance they mistake the town from it there. No one was ever killed there, but we did have a lady that was injured as they dropped, not real bombs, they had dropped these giant sandbags that had just enough of a flash for the navigators to see. But there were some homes that had, like one by the front porch that was destroyed, and others that got roof damage as these giant bags went through in here. Here locally, if you are in Dunnellon, their historic district, there were some of the areas where the Dunnellon Airport was actually an Army Air Corps Air Force base there, and that was the officer quarters for that.